Well, as you heard from that soundbite before from NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg, this is very much about reaffirming the West's support for Ukraine ahead of the winter. And a little bit earlier, Secretary General Stoltenberg told journalists while entering that presidential palace in Bucharest that Putin is using winter as a weapon against Ukrainians, that the Russians are hitting infrastructure. They're trying to essentially freeze Ukrainians out to dampen their resolve. And so the big focus of this meeting is going to be giving Ukraine this comprehensive assistance, not in terms of lethal weapons, but in terms of things to get them through the winter. So medical supplies, heating equipment, infrastructure repairs, the things that Ukraine is really going to need in the coming months, which are going to be very difficult. At the same time, you also heard there from Secretary Blinken a reaffirmation of the U.S. support. We heard in the package earlier that the U.S. is really rushing through some aid to Ukraine. That is because there is concern that once Republicans take over the House of Representatives in January, after having won the election earlier this month, that they are going to be much more difficult in terms of sending aid to Ukraine, and there will be no more blank check, in the words of House Minority, possibly soon to become Majority Leader, Kevin McCarthy. The shadow looming over this meeting, though, is its poignant location. This is the exact spot where in 2008, the outgoing president at the time, George W. Bush, strong-armed European partners into promising Ukraine NATO membership. They issued a statement saying that NATO will see Ukraine and Georgia become members someday. Now, some people believe that this is essentially NATO returning to the scene of the crime, because this was what kicked off the whole crisis. In Moscow's view, certainly, this was a declaration of war by the West against Moscow, and we saw Russia invade Georgia just 4 months after that declaration, and then invade Ukraine and annex Crimea a couple years later in 2014. Now, other people say, no, this was NATO getting ahead of Russia's aggression, that Russia would have invaded anyway. So there's a big debate about whether what happened there at the presidential palace in Bucharest in 2008 needlessly antagonized Russia. It was a move that Germany and France were against at the time, and they were strong-armed by President Bush. But anyway you fall on that debate, it certainly had consequences. And now we're seeing NATO leaders again, this time with foreign ministers, coming to the same spots and dealing with the unprecedented security situation that we have now. So certainly in Moscow's view, this is NATO coming back to what triggered all of this in the first place.
And meanwhile, Dave, the government in Kyiv is still determined to get the West to increase its production and supply of weapons.
Indeed. As I was mentioning, the big focus today is on this comprehensive military package that's direct from NATO. When it comes to actual lethal weapons that are involved in the conflict, that's up to individual NATO countries who have been delivering such lethal weapons. But NATO as a bloc, as it insists, it keeps insisting, NATO is not at war with Russia. NATO is not directly arming Ukraine. Its member states are. Now, there has been concern from Ukraine that the Western countries really need to ramp up their arms production if they're going to keep delivering, keep replacing this outdated Soviet-era military equipment with modern Western military equipment, that they really need to step up the military-industrial complex. And Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba is there in Bucharest today reiterating this message. But again, this comes down to spending and money. And again, we know that Republicans in the House of Representatives are not so keen on pushing so much money still toward Ukraine. And in the West, of course, in the West in general, in Europe, we are entering recession. We are entering some very difficult economic times. And so that message for Ukraine to keep stressing that we need you to keep ramping up arms is very important for Kyiv. But on the other hand, there are some in the West that worry this leads to a new arms race with Russia.
Dave Keating in Brussels, thank you very much.